Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuhu. My name is Dr. Talha Sami. We are broadcasting live from Hadeeqatul Mahdi at the Jalsa Salana, UK of the Ahmadiyya Muslim community. I would like to take you on a journey. That's the journey of Islam all the way from the Middle East in the 7th century to America to this present day and age. This journey has been captured on The Voice of Islam before through the Untold Story of Islam and Black America series in series 1, 2 and 3, where I was joined by special guests such as Hamza Ilyas and Habib Shafiq. This is a special edition of the episode today for the Jalsa Salana. My name is Talha. In the past decade, I have been researching how Islam came exactly to the West as part of individual efforts and the Ahmadiyya Muslim community's history of UK department. This journey has been rather tremendous and fascinating. I would certainly encourage everyone to check out the History of Ahmadiyya UK's exhibition at the convention and also the social media of it. Recently, we developed the Saving the Shah Jahan Mosque episode, where we looked at how exactly the Ahmadiyya Muslim community was pivotal in revitalizing the mission of Islam in England, and no less, it was the same in America too. Starting with myself and exactly how all of this research came around is probably the primary order of the day. I work as a medical physician, yet the love of history has drawn me closer and closer through my time at SOAS, studying Islam and Arabic, and then finally having the privilege to serve in the History of UK department, where we study the history of the Ahmadiyya Muslim community. Now, it transpired to me time and time again, unfortunately, the Ahmadiyya Muslim community is overlooked in the contributions, especially in the Western world. And there are several reasons for that. And perhaps we need to dive into that before we land all the way in America. Unfortunately, due to perhaps prejudice against the Ahmadiyya Muslim community, perhaps due to poor historical skills, perhaps for other reasons, maybe it could be university access or institutional failures. Unfortunately, the Ahmadiyya Muslim community is not given the credence it developed. Unfortunately, it is something that has been overlooked for quite some time, and it is now time to set the record straight. Now, in regards to this is our job to correct the record and show that it was actually the Ahmadiyya Muslim community in almost every shape and form in the modern day and age that would set the first of Islam in the Western world, on the backdrop of the incredible and divine efforts of the Holy Prophet Muhammad, may Allah be pleased with him. Now, in regards to myself, this has involved field research, looking at documents, traveling back and forth around England, America, interviewing elders, being associated and interviewing the Ahmadi Muslim historians that have already laid the groundwork for such incredible efforts. Now, beyond this, reviewing current literature has these aforementioned problems, and perhaps this is the biggest bugbear of the field. The Ahmadiyya Muslim community is not given its due in true historical efforts. Now, this journey starts with Islam and that of the Holy Prophet Muhammad, may Allah be pleased with him. His mission is now probably known to all by 2026, but if not, we can briefly cover it. He proclaimed there was one God. He abolished the idols. He wanted to abolish the idols of race as well. In his final address, he said, "No Arab is better than a non-Arab. No black is better than a white." And similarly so. Now, in a circumstance like this, at a time where emotional ignorance prevailed, where children who were girls were buried alive, where warfare was the order of the day, this was an incredible order for him. And obviously, being divine order, it was something that showed something more is needed to equalize humanity. And unfortunately, these very same problems of race still exist today, as we'll come to. Now, as that message spread, the Muslim empire spread all around the world, our focus needs to be on Africa. And there are a few key things within that original message we could focus on. The first migration of Muslims was to Abyssinia. Indeed, Abyssinia at that time played an amazing part of Islam, something that is often overlooked. The Emperor Najashi became a companion of the Holy Prophet Muhammad, may Allah be pleased with him. In this circumstance, we must understand the place of Africa within the true Islamic message, which often is overlooked or seen as peripheral or marginal. Now, beyond this, an Islamic community eventually became established there. Beyond this, African companions, most notably Hazrat Bilal, may Allah be pleased with him, became a very prominent companion of an Islamic society, and even a post-Muhammad, may Allah be pleased with him, society. What does this indicate? It indicates within the time of the mission of the Holy Prophet, may Allah be pleased with him, there was a time where Bilal was unfortunately treated and meted persecution, but suddenly that was to change. And with the upwardly mobile nature of Islam, he was soon able to rise to one of the foremost companions of an Islamic society. Now, beyond this, I would like to pay attention to the Holy Quran as well, which again emphasizes righteousness. Beyond this, the story of Luqman, potentially an African, is most notable too. Now, even in the time of the Holy Prophet, may Allah be pleased with him, he wrote to prominent emperors, including to that of Najashi and to other leaders of the time, establishing relationships with the leaders of the day. Now, on that note, it's probably worthwhile we take our first break, having established that Islam incorporated a truly African identity whilst solely focusing on a spiritual identity.
You're listening to Voice of Islam Radio, broadcasting live from the annual convention of the Ahmadiyya Muslim Community UK, From Hadeeqatul Mahdi. Stay tuned for an inspiring experience over the next 3 days here at Voice of Islam Radio.
Welcome back. So we were speaking about how Islam reached America, but before that, there's many chapters to arrive at to truly understand why Ahmadi Islam was so powerful in America. We started with the mission of the Holy Prophet Muhammad, may Allah be pleased with him, and that mission was one of equality and peace. Soon after he passed away, that mission would spread. I would like to focus on that journey I mentioned from the Middle East, from the Hijaz, all the way to Africa. Now, North Africa, Spain, parts of Egypt would be the first part that were conquered by the Muslim world. Now, that was indeed very soon, and soon a society of Islam would develop in lands originally not native to it, developing intellectuals such as Ibn Khaldun, intellectuals that came all across the Muslim empire. Now, aside from North Africa, perhaps it is also worthwhile mentioning East and West Africa too. Often the allegation is made Islam has been spread by the sword, but nothing could be more false. Looking at a place like East Africa, that is perhaps one of the best examples. One of the works of Rudolf Ware often focuses on the fact that Islam in Africa has been overlooked, perhaps due to a lack of interest, but it was actually Arabs that would go to East Africa, build communities, marriage through trade and commerce, and establish legendary communities there, which are still present to this day. Now, perhaps the focus should really be on West Africa, because this is part of our journey. Islam is truly an African religion, and this has been voiced by Sylviane Diouf and Rudolf Ware, amongst others. Islam took root, and it truly shaped West African society. In this regard, it became it became a tool of those people like Ayub ibn Suleiman Dajjalo, Umar ibn Sa'id, Mahmud Yarrow, all very prominent Muslims that would unfortunately be taken to America. These are just some examples of Islam in West Africa. But Islam took root in these places, and it truly shaped the culture, the educational systems, and such forth. Perhaps the best example is the Quran school that has been looked at and studied by Dr. Rudolf Ware. Now, Islam flourished all across Africa, naturally across the world as well, within those early centuries after the Holy Prophet Muhammad, may Allah be pleased with him. True, it was glorious. Societies developed. Andalusia and southern Spain flourished. Medicine, astronomy, science, culture, art were all of the things that came from North Africa. So Africa played a very unique identity within Islamic history. And it must be remembered, this was not monolith. It was truly heterogeneous. Islam in West Africa looked completely different to Islam in North Africa. And from a personal note, that's what made this all look so wonderful. Unfortunately, the next chapter as we swiftly move along is a horrible one, and that is the transatlantic slave trade. Some of these individuals we mentioned earlier, they were traders, princes, kings, they were literate, they were polymaths, some of them hufaz, they had memorized the Holy Quran, they would write the Holy Quran, and they were ripped from their West African society through the transatlantic slave trade. Unfortunately, one of the issues of the slave trade, it was perpetuated by some Christian ideals, and we will focus on that in America as well. They faced the Middle Passage, the passage across to America, where slaves would drown, they would be thrown overboard, they would die of starvation. Unfortunately, the journey at the other end would perhaps bear no better consequences for them. Dogs were set on them, they were treated as cattle, they would be killed, they would not be allowed to continue any existing religious systems, which included the religion of Islam. Now, I would like to focus on what this meant from America and American society. Suddenly, white America and perhaps the native Indians of the time were now confronted with a third people, the African Americans. They were now becoming native to America. But due to such chattel slavery, we are talking about dehumanizing efforts that did not let them build their own religion, their class systems, education, marriage, family, even basic rights were denied. It is truly one of the darkest chapters of history. Even after the Emancipation Proclamation, when the slaves were freed, things would not change. There would still be sharecropping, where some of these slaves, although free now by name, they would actually return to the master system because they had no means to go. I would now like to contrast this with the Islamic model of emancipation and slavery. True, Islam gives a realization of slavery that eventually leads to true emancipation by gradually declaring slaves and giving them their freedom and giving them equality. Slaves and slavery would eventually be ended. And this is the work of Dr. Jonathan Brown in America and many others. Unfortunately, the same could not be said for slavery in America. Unfortunately, now a new group of individuals were seen as lower than human. And unfortunately, this was something that even was read out in the Dred Scott decision and official legislation of America. Now, as we mentioned earlier, unfortunately, some of the legitimization of this came through Christianity. Particular pastors, priests, reverends, those involved in the slave trade would cite particular verses in Leviticus, Exodus, other parts of the Bible to justify the transatlantic slave trade. What a horrible way to justify an atrocious act. Now, in this circumstance, it is reported some of the first slave ships were called Jehovah or Jesus. What do you think the indication of the slave master was if they paid any attention at all to religion? It would be to force some of these Muslims, up to 30% of the slave trade of Muslims were said to be Muslim. It would be to snuff out any signs of Islam on the plantation where master looked after slave and eventually become Christian. Now, looking through the 15th, 16th, 17th, 18th century, this is what the African American people were dealt with, and this is the journey that Islam had taken so far. I would like to point out a particularly important fact. Although African Americans were dehumanized in every possible sense of the word, it is important we look back and see them as something different as well. And this point comes, I believe, from Jamila Karim, an American historian. True, this was a dark chapter of history. However, these were scholars, they were travelers, they were thinkers. Some of the Muslim slaves in particular would gain their freedom and eventually get back to the land of their ancestors. Some of them even within their own lifetime of being given slavery as their role and then managing to get back to Africa. These are the stories that are not focused on, and I must say, in a post 9/11 world where there is now a focus on understanding Islam in America, there needs to be the understanding that Islam first potentially came through the transatlantic slave trade, and we need to see these explorers for what they were and not just simple slaves. On that note, I would like to take a break in our journey of Islam in Black America.
This is Voice of Islam Radio, coming to you live from the blessed grounds of Hadeeqatul Mahdi, the home of Jalsa Salana, the annual convention of the Ahmadiyya Muslim community in the UK. Join us for spiritual reflections, inspiring speeches, and the true spirit of peace and unity. Stay with us for a live Jalsa coverage all day long.
Welcome back to the untold story of Islam in Black America. We are going on a journey from Islam in the Middle East with its inception all the way to America. We briefly began with how Islam radically changed Arabian society, and soon that change would spread to Africa, east, west, north, and Saharan Africa. Unfortunately, the next chapter was darker when we discussed briefly the transatlantic slave trade. Now, during that time, something rather radically unique was happening thousands of miles away, and that was in 1889. Hazrat Mirza Ghulam Ahmad, the founder of the Ahmadiyya Muslim community, was fighting all theological combatants against Islam in Qadian in India. And indeed, in 2026 at the Jalsa Salana UK, we are looking back at exactly what that means. And indeed, it's wondrous for us to be speaking about Islam in Black America with this message and with this lens. I would like to just put this into context. The 19th century, as Maulana Rahim Dard, may Allah be pleased with him, who was a companion of the promised Messiah, alayhi salam, said, the 19th century saw a lot of change, whether we were looking at X-rays or trains, development, globalization. Now, in this time, the promised Messiah saw Islam was gravely under attack from all corners, unfortunately, from parts of the Muslim world themselves. Positioned in India in the 20th century, that message would carry on and continue on. Unfortunately, where Islam was still being attacked through that time, and the Ahmadiyya Muslim community through its inception and later would be working to retaliate and respond theologically. Now, this attack came from all corners. Indeed, the British Empire had come to India and brought Christianity with them, and in some cases indeed forced Christianity upon the Indians, and an example may be the Goa Inquisition. Now, the promised Messiah alayhi salam saw this, and he would write aggressively against Christians and what he saw as their false creed of making Jesus divine. I would like to really emphasize this point because indeed it was the Christian theology which caused the slave trade, which would be so potent in America, that would cause people to accept Islam. Although the promised Messiah was working in India, his message was truly global. Indeed, the history of Ahmadiyya UK exhibition during this Jalsa Salana, you'll be able to focus on that as well, and indeed how that message came westward. Now, whether it was sending 8,000 letters, whether it was writing and inviting the Queen to Islam, his message was truly unprecedented and unparalleled. I'd like to make a very serious and grave point on this. Often, looking at the history of Islam in the Western world, we see that Hazrat Mirza Ghulam Ahmad is a footnote of Islam in the Western world. Rather, it is the reverse. Islam in the West is a footnote of the promised Messiah alayhi salam, and I believe we'll establish that. Now, Islam in the Western world at the time of the promised Messiah was almost largely non-existent, and perhaps we can speak about India, perhaps we can speak about England and America and the connection between all of them. There was not the immigration we saw in the 1960s. There were small communities, say, of Yemenis, Muslim communities in Liverpool, in London, but these were quite small indeed. Even in America, immigrants from the Levant of Syria and Turkey had gone to America, but only for that of a better day. There had been no Islamic serious communities that were intent on proselytizing, keeping the fast of Ramadan, organizing the 5 prayers, and from a missionary purpose, spreading the religion of Islam. But one man was to change all of that, and that would be Hazrat Mirza Ghulam Ahmad of Qadian alayhi salam. What is incredible for this small little town in Qadian, he invites Americans who sit with him to his village. He would then write to people like Alexander Dowie, sat in America with his pomp and glory, commanding crowds from Madison Square Garden, thousands and thousands of dollars, establishing his city of Zion. Or we could speak of someone like Pigot in England, again, claiming falsely religious divinity. Now, beyond this, we must understand he was combating any attacks against the religion of Islam. And unfortunately, as we just established, in England and America, the Islamic community was not there to do this for themselves, but he heard it, he saw it, and he responded. And indeed, the death of Dowie, he said, was seen as a sign for his truth, and the breaking of the cross that was prophesied by the Holy Prophet Muhammad, may Allah be pleased with him. Now, I would like to add some history more to this. Dr. Fatima Fanusi has said that the Dowie interactions are almost completely silent. She has also gone on to say something similar about Alexander Russell Webb and their interactions with the promised Messiah. What is rather interesting here is that although we speak about Islam in America, this chapter of the promised Messiah's interactions with the Western world are often completely missed by those outside of the community. Indeed, this spreads to Quilliam in Liverpool. Now, although these Islamic communities existed, they truly struggled and they were not able to sustain and maintain in their own lifetime. And that would rather be the complete opposite when Ahmadi Islam landed in the form of missionaries in America. And eventually that would soon be the case. And there was one particular companion that would be notable, and he is perhaps the pioneer, the innovative Hazrat Mufti Sadiq, may Allah be pleased with him, that was able to introduce en masse Islam to Black America. An incredible individual. He became an Ahmadi Muslim and pledged his allegiance to the promised Messiah at an early age. He was literate in several languages, sharp, erudite. People picked up on his dress, on his turbans, on even to the point of people mentioned how small his hands were. Everything about him was phenomenal, fantastic. Having interviewed even those that saw him, even a century later, who remember him, they remember him as loving, warm, smart, a family man, but dedicated to the mission of spreading Ahmadi Islam. Unfortunately, Islam had not been spread in the same way in America and England, but it was indeed this man that would do that. Now, he would spend some time in England before. England, maybe you could say, was a little bit of a precursor to the mission in America. He was here for about 3 years, between the years of approximately 1917 to 1920, before he would depart to America. Now, whilst he was here, the London mission, indeed, I would like to just highlight the History of Ahmadiyyat UK exhibition focusing on the London mission this year in 2026. The London mission was truly up and running, and it had been up and running from almost 1913 in England, where efforts had been made by the Ahmadi Muslim community after the death of the promised Messiah alayhi salam to spread Islam in London, in the heart of the empire. This became truly the first Muslim missionary group all the way into the Western world, in the heart of the empire, whilst India was being colonized. Something truly unique and phenomenal. I would like to re-emphasize the point made earlier. This is what makes Islam a footnote in the life of Hazrat Mirza Ghulam Ahmad of Qadian, as opposed to his efforts being a footnote of Islam in the West. Now, the mission in England, if we just briefly focus upon that before our next break, and I promise you we'll get to America soon. In 1913, a mosque had been established already for several years in Woking by a Jewish teacher called Gottlieb Leitner. Unfortunately, after his death, despite being a tremendous organizer, instructor, and educator, that mosque was not to last. Its doors would close. It would be the first Khalifa who would continue the Ahmadi mission in England by instructing companions of the promised Messiah to reactivate that mosque. Soon the mission would grow farther than this older building. It would be a newer building, and indeed it would be the Fazl Mosque, which becomes the first mosque of London. This land was acquired by another pioneering missionary. Indeed, he was the first missionary of the Ahmadi movement to the Western world. This would be Hazrat Chaudhry Fateh Siyal, may Allah be pleased with him. Now, having acquired the land of the mosque in 1920, soon, eventually, the inauguration would occur in 1924, 1926, further events would occur, and there would be a place to call home in England for the Ahmadi Muslim community, and finally Islam had a home of its own in the capital, being the first mosque of London. It would host people like Muhammad Ali Jinnah, Amir Faisal of Saudi Arabia, countless dignitaries, politicians, purely for the purposes of spreading the message of Islam, Ahmadiyyat, all across the globe, while similarly fighting for Palestine, for Pakistan, and other independent movements of that time. Now it'd be from here where this incredible individual, Hazrat Mufti Sadiq, may Allah be pleased with him, eventually would leave and depart to America. And this would eventually enter the next chapter of the untold story of Islam in Black America.
From the heart of Hadeeqatul Mahdi, this is Voice of Islam Radio, your spiritual companion throughout Jalsa Salana UK 2026. Experience the power of unity, hear inspiring speeches, and feel the global brotherhood as we bring you live coverage from the Jalsa site. Whether you're near or far, let the message of peace, faith, and love uplift your soul. You're listening to the live Jalsa broadcast only on Voice of Islam Radio. Stay tuned, stay inspired.
Welcome back to the Untold Story of Islam in Black America special edition for the Jalsa Salana convention in the UK 2026. Now, we were focusing on Hazrat Mufti Sadiq, may Allah be pleased with him, his missionary efforts within England about bringing Islam in a pioneering and missionary way to England and soon America that has not been discussed thus far in a serious way in academic literature. And this is where the untold story of Islam in Black America comes. Now, he had spent time in England, the land that we are in now, but eventually that message would also go to America. We focused previously how Ahmadi Islam had reached the message already to America through the pioneering works of Mirza Ghulam Ahmad of Qadian, the promised Messiah, alayhi salam. Now, Hazrat Mirza Ghulam Ahmad, alayhi salam, of Qadian, he managed to defeat Dowie in a prayer duel, he managed to speak to Alexander Russell Webb, who would indeed be a pioneering American. Although perhaps Webb had not formally accepted the message of Ahmadi Islam, he would do his own to generate a magazine, a few magazines, a mosque in America. Unfortunately, even within his own lifetime, he would retreat from missionary efforts despite being a white American. Sadly, the same could be said of Abdullah Quilliam in Liverpool. My point being is that native efforts to spread Islam in the Western world realistically failed. But it would be the Ahmadi Muslim community that would build sustainable efforts. Indeed, one of the entry points that we're focusing on is Islam in Black America. As he set out on the SS Haverford, eventually landing in February 1920, he was entering a pioneering phase of his life once again. He converted several people on the ship that he was on. He fell sick on the ship, and indeed he would fall sick later of his time in America too, needing specialist care. Actually a trend that several missionaries did fall sick whilst abroad. Now, he lands in February 1920, and it's not with open arms. He's imprisoned in detention for several weeks. Pages and pages of legislation are written. Ahmadi Muslim writers are outraged across the world, saying, why do you report to have freedom of speech in America, but when a missionary of Islam comes, there is a problem? Indeed, that is abound within the Al-Fazl and Review of Religions of the time. And what was his crime? It was that in having the theological belief that one man can provide for more than one woman. That was already legitimate, I believe, in particular states of America, but for a Muslim to hold this belief, this was clearly a problem. And sadly, this would be one of many challenges starting right out of the gate that Hazrat Mufti Sadiq, may Allah be pleased with him, had. And it would be one of several. What I have noticed looking at the work of Richard Brent Turner, which is incredible, I must add, of Robert Danin and many others, although they do pay tribute to the works of Hazrat Mufti Sadiq, may Allah be pleased with him, unfortunately that personal understanding of his tribulations was not there. Perhaps it is time to reconsider exactly what that means. Now, it starts right out of the gate. His mission is already halted in 1920 as he lands. And it is through prayers and prayers alone that he is freed. And the Muslims within the country perhaps were excited to see a missionary, and indeed that is how he is known, as the missionary of Islam, which would actually be the title held by the later Ahmadi Muslim missionaries of the community. Now, as soon as he is free, you can imagine him pounding the pavement, or the sidewalk, as they say, of New York. He is looking to establish mosques, reading rooms, provide literature, tour, and he does this all across the country for his tenure of almost 3 years. He goes between the places of New York, Detroit, Chicago, sometimes visiting these places multiple times. Now, there are perhaps several things he did here, and indeed there are at least, I believe, approximately 10 points which made Islam so appealing to the African Americans of that time that we'll go into. His efforts, I think, would culminate in what he himself said that he wanted: a thriving congregation, a mosque, and a magazine. He would indeed complete all three. Sadiq Mosque is still on the same grounds it was 100 years later, with a thriving congregation. I visited it just a few weeks ago, and I can lay testament to that fact personally. A magazine, the Muslim Sunrise, still runs today, 100 years later. Now, the mosque itself, still present, although having taken alterations and updates and renovation. Now, perhaps this is the place to focus on these 10 points. And if we understand, coming back to what he saw, I would like you to go back with me to 1920 America. He was an Indian man, a dark-skinned man, wearing a turban and slippers and all the trinkets of an Indian man coming to America. And he perhaps saw a rather odd system of segregation. Perhaps, being from India, he would have seen signs of whites only and coloureds elsewhere. but it was very stark to him, and soon he wrote about it. And this would abound on the pages of the Muslim Sunrise in his time, where he called for racial equality time and time again, condemning the Jim Crow segregation of the day. Unfortunately, where we left the African Americans was that we saw that slavery had failed them and American society had failed them. The next period of that was Reconstruction, and to the point that it has been termed deconstruction. And this is what Hazrat Mufti Sadiq, may Allah be pleased with him, saw. Unfortunately, the South was no longer home and a place for African Americans, so the Great Migration occurred, where millions went to northern cities. Eventually, these cities would become urban, industrialized, and home to churches, and soon Islam and a mosque. And that was pioneered by Hazrat Mufti Sadiq, may Allah be pleased with him. He saw this. He saw the segregation, which was the worst on Sundays, as black churches and white churches would offer prayers separately. He condemned this, and he offered a unique faith space to all. Indeed, he condemned the failure of Christianity, talking of Christian profiteers that profited from slavery. He spoke of how Islam was the original religion of the black man and Arabic was the original language of the black man. He said to African Americans, Christianity failed you, come to Islam, leave it now. Christianity has been no good for you. And this is where it started, and this is 1920. Patrick Bowen, a tremendous scholar, I must add, has said it was 1920 where the African American Islamic Renaissance occurs, and it is no coincidence that that is exactly the date of when Hazrat Mufti Sadiq, may Allah be pleased with him, landed. As a footnote, I would like to add, Islam had not been organized in the same way in America at this time. There were pseudo-Islamic groups, whether in New Jersey, New York, individuals of no large global organization that had mentioned Islam but not come to proselytize in any global manner from the East. Indeed, that was the first of the Ahmadiyya Muslim community. Whilst we are here, although this story does relate to that of the African American Ahmadis, which I promised you are going to get there, but perhaps you can see the journey that we've had, he also served the Turks, the Arabs that had come to. Indeed, in 1921, he helps Hussein Karub build perhaps what is the first mosque in Detroit in Highland Park. I'd like to now add another historical point as we segue again. Previous efforts often say of this time that it was his Ahmadi theology that was a problem. Some tremendous work by Ghulam Misbah and others of the Ahmadiyya Muslim community have actually said no. It was Christian ideology coming in from converts. It was the nationalistic rivalries of the Turks and Arabs at the time that made that mission fail. Soon that Detroit mission would close, and Mufti Sadiq, before it closed, would leave. He would find place elsewhere. As we get to Chicago and Sadiq Mosque, I would like to just take a break, and soon we'll return to the untold story of Islam in Black America.
Celebrating 10 years of spreading the true teachings of Islam. Broadcasting live from the blessed grounds of Hadeeqatul Mahdi in Hampshire, the home of Jalsa Salana, UK. One voice, the voice of Islam.
Muhammadur Rasulullah.
So, as we return to the untold story of Islam in Black America, we have ventured from the Middle East all the way through Africa and finally England and America. We have spoken about the nature of the 19th century, whether it saw progress in the Western and the Eastern world, but also, unfortunately, the unequal and uneven conditions of Islam within America. It was an unsteady footing, and the racial inequality of America. Seeing this, Mufti Sadiq, may Allah be pleased with him, Hazrat Mufti Sadiq, may Allah be pleased with him, saw this. America was a place of truly global development, of epic proportions. The roaring 1920s, as they're known, saw great industrialization as America would be catapulted onto the world stage in the next several decades. But something didn't sit right with him. He spoke of the lack of spirituality. He spoke of the corruption of the Christian priests. He spoke of the attacks of Islam. And unfortunately, it all started with his own mission where he was imprisoned. He would indeed have to move and relocate to get his message as far as possible. He encountered opposition from Christians. Even, he said, assassination attempts were made against him. He was against all odds as one man, converting up to 700, perhaps more, people. I would like to focus now on the nature of his efforts and why indeed it was his efforts that were so pivotal in 1920 for the next century, all the way even up to 2020 for African Americans who saw Islam. Let's start with Sadiq Mosque. He wanted to develop something truly multiracial. Not only was this something theoretical within the Muslim Sunrise, it was practiced and lived in his own mosque. Aliyah Ali from Kenner, Louisiana, was visiting Chicago and saw his ad in a newspaper. Interesting, he advertised in black newspapers in the women's section, pointed out by Sylvia Chan Malik. She saw it and was interested. She began attending Sadiq Mosque. The whites, the Europeans, the Americans were not comfortable with the Jim Crow segregation and apartheid, essentially, where blacks and whites were separate, now eventually being dissolved in front of their own eyes, with a poor black lady attending the mosque. At the risk of losing his entire congregation, Hazrat Mufti Sadiq, may Allah be pleased with him, stood on point, and he said and insisted on her being there. They all left. And indeed, perhaps it was that anti-racial nature that actually handicapped the mission, but indeed he lived on principle. So establishing a multiracial mission, which indeed we saw through even other companions of him whilst he was in America, with missions springing up in New York, St. Louis, Chicago, Detroit, Indianapolis. This was his aim, and this was what he would leave behind. Now, there are several points to focus upon as to what he was doing and why Islam resonated on this background of everything we had said so far. This included him pointing towards Africa as this great ontological symbol. He identified what had happened and he spoke to it. He would speak in an intelligent and reasoned manner, using the failure of Christianity, the transracial and anti-racial nature of Islam, suddenly making poor Christians who had come from Mississippi not being accepted within a white church, global brothers of a Muslim community that were now suddenly concerned with happenings in Qadian and Africa around the world. Now, he prepared for a future. He would eventually build and establish these institutions, the term institution being broad. It would even include leaders, people who often would come from Christianity. Now, he would establish them, teach them, and train them. Given the vast expanse of America, they would then be let loose on America in his absence. Some Indian as well, Yusuf Khan being one of them. Now, we spoke about him traveling all across these cities, and perhaps it has sounded rather glorious what he has done, and indeed it was, although it came with intense trials and tribulations. And I think perhaps what has been missed in the past several decades of studying Islam in America has been the FBI interference. The intense surveillance of all black communities is well noted, but indeed Patrick Bowen has made the point it started with the Ahmadi Muslim community. Now, looking at perhaps why this would occur, he worked with the black thinkers of the day. Indeed, Rashid Ahmed American, the first African-American missionary who studied in Rava, leaving America, imagine that, in 1949, to go to a new country of Pakistan where there were tents, just to study Islam. Indeed, we should mention Rashid Ahmed American as someone who is in the same realms of a Malcolm X and a Martin Luther King, being a religious figure, traveling the Middle East, penning his own biography, leading a community. The list goes on. But to the point that Rashid Ahmed American spoke of his times with Hazrat Mufti Sadiq, may Allah be pleased with him, has said that indeed Hazrat Mufti Sadiq met some prominent black thinkers of the day, one of which potentially included Marcus Garvey. He had established the UNIA, a movement for black Americans with up to membership of 100,000 people. Garveyites, those who followed him, would attend the Sadiq Mosque. He tapped into black thinkers, whether they were the thinkers leading organizations or newspapers, or even as he stood on a soapbox outside churches, as his compatriots did, or as his other faith leaders did, to bring people to Ahmadi Islam. Now, all good things must come to an end, as they say, and indeed his time would come to an end in America. I would like to just summarize some of his efforts as we've gotten to the end of his journey, but the journey would definitely and certainly must continue before we come to our next break. He would establish what is now the longest running mosque, still there, Sadiq Mosque, the longest standing magazine, the Muslim Sunrise, which is now called the Muslim Sunrise. He left a congregation. He would be able to institute 5 daily prayers, Ramadan, Eid, etc., etc. The Islamic institutions and the literature that he brought set the foundations for further missionaries to come. These were all the first of the Ahmadiyya Muslim community in America. As African Americans saw Christianity had failed them, that Jesus had died, they suddenly began to reevaluate their own beliefs, and they were drawn in, originally in their hundreds and later thousands, to the Ahmadi Muslim message of Islam in America. He was someone that had been investigated, imprisoned, persecuted. Christian pastors sought to even assassinate him, he reports, to demolish his organization. He would eventually leave gloriously, going back after several hard years as an elderly man back to the home that he called home and where he wanted to spend all his life and his final days. That was the story of Hazrat Mufti Sadiq, may Allah be pleased with him. Indeed, his legacy lives on 100 years later, as the American Ahmadiyya Muslim community has its own roots now within the country. Let's take our next break to see what transpired after 1923.
يا من غدا في نوره وضيائه.
You're listening to Voice of Islam Radio, broadcasting live from the annual convention of the Ahmadiyya Muslim Community UK, from Hadeeqatul Mahdi. Stay tuned for an inspiring experience over the next 3 days here at Voice of Islam Radio.
It has been a whirlwind journey. We went all the way from the Middle East in the 7th century to Africa and all the way to England and America. In that journey, we looked at the racial equality that Islam gave, the emancipatory teachings it gave, how it uplifted civilizations in North Africa, East Africa, West Africa, with these efforts marred by the transatlantic slave trade. Eventually, Islam would come in the modern day and age through Hazrat Mufti Sadiq, may Allah be pleased with him, landing in America. We left off just before the break at 1923 when he would sail off. But he left several foundational legacies that are still present today. Missionaries will now suddenly pour into America over the next several decades, most notably of Hazrat Maulvi Muhammad Deen, another prominent companion of the promised Messiah, Sufi Bengali, who would provide the longest Islamic presence for almost 20 years, from the years of 1928-29 all the way to 48-49, at a time where there was no other missionary of Islam or true Islamic movement. Indeed, his time is quite remarkable. He would eventually write books like The Life of Muhammad, perhaps the first book written on American soil for American masses about the Holy Prophet Muhammad, may Allah be pleased with him, that was en masse available. Now, all of these efforts come on the background of the Khilafat, the leadership of the Ahmadiyya Muslim community, which had indeed directed Hazrat Mufti Sadiq, may Allah be pleased with him. I would like to just go back to 1920 and 21, when that first message of the Muslim Sunrise is from the second Khalifa, who oversees all of these missionaries arriving in America and all the institutional efforts. He speaks of the pioneers in colonization of the Western world. Unfortunately, that had come at a loss of their religious values, and indeed it would be the Ahmadi Muslims, it would be the pioneers of Islam in America and of spirituality. Now, further companions of the second Khalifa, may Allah be pleased with him, would come to America. Indeed, we would see them turning in and out, particularly towards the late 1940s, and then furthermore, more and more Ahmadi missionaries pile into America. Often mosques would now suddenly spring up in some of the places where African Americans would be. As we mentioned, St. Louis, we mentioned Chicago, New York, and we'll speak on that in a second, Indianapolis, Detroit, and even towards the 50s, Los Angeles. All of these would be hotspots for African Americans, Ahmadi Muslims seeking out converts for those who felt disaffected and disavowed from Christianity. And eventually they would find Ahmadi Islam as a race equalizer. And we still see the legacy of those same Ahmadi Muslims today who are walking around the Jalsa Salana today, American or African American, at this convention in 2026 in Hadeeqatul Mahdi today. I'd like to focus on a particularly unique chapter of the thought of the day. Now, as that rhetoric, as we spoke of Marcus Garvey, of back to Africa that he championed, died down and things changed moving into the 40s and the 50s, the sound and the mood music of the day was rather different. And it became bebop, something that we have focused on in our series on the Voice of Islam. Bebop was rather a unique form of jazz, and eventually these jazz musicians would seek out the truth, being perhaps educationally literate, sharp thinkers, smart. They would find Ahmadi Islam in centers like New York and themselves become zealous proselytizers of Islam, spreading it up to 200 musicians, some lists indicate, and most of them, if not many of them, or at least a substantial amount, were Ahmadi Muslim, and include people like Yusuf Lateef and Ahmad Jamal, Grammy award-winning musicians, those who would visit the White House, those that would educate others, working in institutions such as universities and elsewhere. Very unique phase of American history, and jazz is truly a uniquely American identity. Now, beyond that, moving into the 60s and the 70s, as the mood music perhaps was not bebop or jazz anymore, it would soon be the civil rights movement, and Ahmadi thinkers would look rather differently, and the mood music certainly was not jazz, but it would be faith, space, equality, something that Ahmadi Muslims had actually already encountered since 1920, since the Ahmadi Muslim mission had landed in America. Now, articles calling for racial equality indeed would be published, and Ahmadi Muslims would turn to the prayer mat to seek their equality. Perhaps I would also like to focus on indeed the incredible story of Rashid Ahmed, American. When we think of Islam in America, perhaps other Islamic groups, Malcolm X, Malika Shabazz, are thought about, but I put to you, why not people like Rashid Ahmed, American, came from the meanest walks of life in St. Louis and later Milwaukee. But he is someone that sees the message of Ahmadi Islam. Working in the streets, he sees and hears a man saying, Jesus didn't die on the cross, and he's intrigued. Having spent time with other religious figures, he felt they were only interested in money, but something was rather different. He would proceed to the missionaries' abode, and he smelt something rather different, and he was wondering, what's the hustle here? He thought it was some kind of opium or crack. Indeed, it was the native Indian food, and he kept coming back time and time again. He would suddenly straighten his life out, buy a ticket, and go all the way to Pakistan, a newly created country, in around 1949. He would study with the second Khalifa of the day. He's a traveler, an explorer. He's a writer. He penned his own biography years before any other notable Islamic movement was doing such a thing, and he would come back to America and he would lead Americans. Americans had already seen what Islam looked like for them, being led by Americans, but perhaps not someone who had become a theological missionary in the same way. Indeed, this is what sets the Ahmadi Muslim community aside. Now, perhaps the growth of the chapters is something rather interesting as well. As we close off, we would see chapters spread up and continue all the way from that 1920 moment when Hazrat Mufti Sadiq, may Allah be pleased with him, arrived. whether that was New York, which would hold the musicians and readers too, or whether it be Dayton, which would see some more militant thinking and black thinking of the times as they would temper their thoughts as they entered Ahmadi Islam, or whether it was the educated guys in Boston, indeed Maulana Azhar Hanif being one of them and his father being a prominent member of that group as well. We must also speak of the women and the incredible trials and tribulations that they faced from the early sewing circle and all the way through the formation of Lajna Amala, often leading the way. As Islam was a new identity, women often held chapter posts and posts separate that are now separate. In this day and age, they often would lead each chapter or city, whether it was financial secretary or president. They were certainly the powerhouse of Islam in America, and they must be recognized as such. Now, as the 70s press on, travel becomes something that is new. These African Americans suddenly start going to Mecca, Medina, and Rava, and even to Africa. That back and forth of Marcus Garvey, which we spoke of, suddenly now becomes real, and back and forth is alive and well for the African American Ahmadis, connecting with their culture, staying true to the point that Hazrat Mufti Sadiq gave in 1921 to 1923, specifically about Africa is your true homeland and Arabic is your language and Islam is your religion. When they would go to Rava, they would spend time with the Khalifa, bringing stories back to America, and the early pages of the Muslim Sunrise from the 70s are testament to that. Even speaking to pioneering individuals, they still recount the moments with the Khalifa in India to me to this day, 50, 60 years after the fact, about how powerful indeed it was. Now, we've been on a whirlwind journey of Islam from the Middle East all the way through to Africa and to America, and we've rushed through how that journey of Islam has been truly unique to the African Americans. It's something that we have captured on the Untold Story of Black Islam in America on The Voice of Islam. I would recommend to check out those podcasts. I think they'll certainly go into a lot more depth, but particularly you might pull out the nuances more from them than we've covered from this 1 hour summary that we have of the past century. So broadcasting live from Jalsa Salana, UK, I would recommend you to also come out, check out the History of Ahmadiyyat UK exhibition whilst we're here as well. Indeed, Fazl Mosque was the centre of the world, still is, and it would see the missionaries from there even go to America and around the world, indeed Africa as well. This is indeed the untold story of Black Islam in America, and thank you for joining me.
Muhammadur Rasulullah,